Perfect. Yes, I'm Jessica Lunsford-Avery. I'm a clinical psychologist, an associate professor of psychiatry at Duke University. Um, Really excited to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. All right. So all of the work that I will be sharing today was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health in the US. I have received other research funding, but I will not be talking about any of that research today. So to start us off, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a condition characterized by elevated levels of inattention, hyperactivity, and/or impulsivity that are occurring at a frequency and severity that are unexpected given the developmental stage of the individual. ADHD is a highly prevalent condition impacting about 10% of the pediatric population and about 5 to 6% of adults worldwide. And what's interesting about ADHD is that we do have now decades of research supporting both pharmacological and psychosocial treatments for ADHD. However, we know that the disorder continues to be associated with pervasive functional impairments despite these best practice treatments. So in childhood, these are things like academic and social impairment. In adulthood, things like occupational, interpersonal, and health outcomes tend to be more adverse for individuals with ADHD, and they're also at risk for earlier mortality. So when we think about doing a better job of treating this disorder, it's important to note that increasingly we are viewing ADHD as a 24-hour disorder, characterized by both its daytime impairments as well as pervasive sleep problems at night. So here in the tan bubble, you see the common symptoms of ADHD. What you may note as you look at them is that these are also symptoms of having sleep disturbances. So there is a high degree of overlap in the clinical presentations between ADHD and sleep disturbances, really highlighting for us why sleep may play such a critical role in ADHD. Unfortunately, our treatments for ADHD to date primarily focus on daytime deficits, and as such are very unlikely to address this full picture. But one of the challenges that we do face in thinking about better treatments for ADHD is that these mechanisms between sleep and ADHD are not currently well understood. And so we can see that, thinking about something like light exposure, this may play a key role in ADHD pathology. So evidence suggests that globally, ADHD prevalence is lowest in geographic areas with the highest solar intensity. We see that ADHD symptoms tend to lessen during summer months with seasonal light variability as the proposed mechanism. And there's also some evidence in adults with ADHD that they may be oversensitive to light compared to those without the disorder. And importantly, part of the hypothesis is that the influence of light exposure on ADHD pathology may be mediated, at least in part, by its impact on circadian rhythm regulation. So one finding within the ADHD literature is that adolescents with ADHD do tend to display more irregular and delayed sleep patterns compared to their neurotypical peers. This is believed to stem from circadian dysfunction, although we do not have a lot of great research in that area, so I'll talk about that in a minute. And so in our study, we were interested in this relatively recent finding from Anthony Hand, where he looked at light regularity, which he defined as the kind of that consistency and day-to-day timing and light exposure. It may be particularly critical to optimal circadian functioning, and he had related it to sleep regularity and timing in a non-clinical sample of adolescents, so those who do not necessarily have an ADHD diagnosis. However, whether light exposure irregularity contributes to irregular and delayed sleep in adolescents with ADHD is currently unknown. So in the current study I wanted to share today, we had two primary goals. The first was to evaluate differences in light exposure regularity among adolescents with ADHD versus healthy controls without psychiatric conditions. And then we wanted to associate that light regularity with aspects of sleep. So things like sleep regularity and timing, chronotype preference, and also daytime sleepiness. And finally, we had an exploratory aim to assess associations between light regularity and daytime cognitive performance. So we had 46 Adolescents in the study is a relatively small study, 20 with a confirmed diagnosis of ADHD, 26 healthy controls. These were adolescents aged 13 to 17, so high school aged in the US. Typical IQ and willing to comply with study requirements. For our ADHD group, they had to meet criteria for ADHD, any presentation based on DSM-5 criteria. We excluded individuals across groups with significant medical conditions, most psychotropic use, substance abuse, first-degree relatives with severe mental illness. In the healthy control group, we excluded any DSM-5 diagnosis that was confirmed by our team. And for the ADHD group, we actually excluded all DSM-5 diagnoses other than ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, because we're really trying to look at an ADHD-specific group. It's an overview of our procedure. During the screening, we did a gold standard assessment for ADHD and all DSM-5 diagnoses. We did a clinician-led diagnostic interview, had parents and adolescents rate ADHD severity, and adolescents completed a cognitive test. They entered the actigraphy stage, where we had adolescents wear a Philips ActiWatch Spectrum Plus. They had to have at least 5 days of recording to participate in this analysis, and they also completed a daily sleep diary. Then we had a follow-up visit where they did also complete self-report measures of morningness, eveningness on the morningness, eveningness scale for children and the Cleveland Adolescent Sleepiness Questionnaire. And it's important to note that participation was restricted to the school year, which in North Carolina is the beginning of September until the beginning of June. And this was to try to control some for the impact of summer on these measures. And so we, like I mentioned, we used a Philips ActiWatch, and these were our primary measures of interest. The light regularity index was defined as it was in Anthony Hand's paper in 2023 as the probability that individuals exposed to light at any 2 time points 24 hours apart. We also looked at the sleep regularity index, which is the probability of being in the same state, awake or asleep, at any 2 time points 24 hours apart, and sleep midpoint. This is our index of sleep timing. And in our data analyses, we used linear regressions to examine group differences in light regularity, partial Pearson correlations to examine associations of light regularity with the sleep and cognitive measures. All of our analyses varied for sex and age. And for cognitive performance, we did a sensitivity analysis where we also assessed the relationship between light regularity and cognition after controlling for sleep regularity, duration, and timing. So this is what we found. We found this, starting with our group differences, that our adolescents with ADHD did display lower light regularity scores than our healthy controls, which suggested less regular light exposure in that group. And interestingly, unlike potentially some other previous studies, we did not find group differences on actigraphy measured sleep regularity or timing. However, our adolescents with ADHD did report greater eveningness chronotype and more daytime sleepiness than our healthy controls. When we looked at relationships with sleep, we found that this is in the full sample, lower light regularity was associated with lower sleep regularity, later sleep midpoint, greater eveningness preference, and greater daytime sleepiness at the trend level on the last one. And in the ADHD group, so when we looked at it separately by groups, what we saw was that the light regularity index was associated with sleep regularity and later sleep timing. These associations were not significant in healthy controls. So you can see our ADHD group in the navy blue and our healthy controls in the light pink. So from our main 2 aims, what we saw was that adolescents with ADHD displayed less regular light exposure than their typically developing peers. The irregular light exposure was associated with irregular and delayed sleep, particularly in our adolescents with ADHD, but we were curious about how this might relate to daytime performance. And so in our exploratory aim, just to provide a little bit of rationale for why we're curious at looking at this, we do know from the literature that regular light exposure plays a role in cognition. So we know that light can impact cognition directly by increasing arousal and indirectly by helping to regulate the circadian system. And we know that ADHD in particular is a condition that is linked with elevated risk for cognitive deficits, which in turn, within the ADHD population, are key drivers of functional impairment. So we recently proposed that regularity and light exposure might be a potentially key contributor to ADHD-related cognitive deficits. That's an editorial that we wrote for the journal Sleep. And we hypothesized that this might be related to the influence of light on circadian rhythm regulation, particularly in adolescents. However, we don't know whether irregularity in light exposure contributes to cognitive deficits among our adolescents with ADHD, and whether such relationships are mediated by disrupted sleep patterns. So you might remember when I talked about the procedure, I mentioned that we had given the adolescents the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Cognitive Test. And so this is a test that is primarily supposed to measure intelligence, which we think of as a crystallized cognitive measure. But when we think about what goes into performance on these types of tasks, certainly we need that verbal and nonverbal reasoning. That's what the test is intended to evaluate. However, in order to perform well in this test, you also have to demonstrate things like sustained attention, access to declarative memory, rely on your working memory, and engage in problem solving. And so there's several aspects of cognition that do go into performing well on this test. So this was an exploratory analysis, as I said. What we found was in the full sample, lower light regularity was correlated with poorer overall cognitive performance on the K-bit measure. We also saw that verbal, but not nonverbal cognitive performance was related to light regularity exposure. And then when we separated our findings by group, we saw that in the ADHD group, light regularity was associated both with the composite and also verbal cognitive performance. You see the verbal performance here on the right. Again, the ADHD is in the navy blue. These relationships remained significant in a sensitivity analysis where we controlled for sleep regularity. I meant to mention sleep duration and also sleep midpoint. The associations between light regularity and cognitive performance were not significant in our healthy controls. And so a couple of take-homes from this study, light regularity was lower in our adolescents with ADHD. It was associated with less regular and delayed sleep patterns in that group. Lower light regularity was also associated with poor daytime cognitive performance, particularly for our adolescents with ADHD. This study has several very important limitations. This is a small sample. We had limited cognitive measures. Light was captured at the wrist level. And we did not, in this study, have any objective measure of circadian function, which would help us understand potentially some of these relationships. So looking to the future, some questions on my mind is whether irregular light exposure may play a causal role in irregular and delayed sleep and poor cognition in adolescents with ADHD. Everything I showed you today is correlational. And also curious to what extent is this mediated by circadian dysfunction? And so when we think about future studies, these studies could use larger samples, include a range of cognitive measures and gold standard assessments of light and circadian function, and could assess whether things like chronotherapy, employing regularly timed light exposure, could improve sleep and cognition in the ADHD population. And also to clarify the specific direct and indirect mechanisms by which light regularity could support cognitive performance among adolescents with ADHD. And so ultimately, when I kind of scale all the way back to the big picture, I think the really important question and things that we can really be thinking about as a field is what role might light and circadian interventions play in closing that ADHD treatment gap. So you may remember at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned ADHD is associated with a range of adverse functional and health outcomes. We do believe that personalized treatments that target these functional impairments may make a big difference in the quality of life of individuals with ADHD. And it may be that light and circadian treatments can help us to bridge that gap. A lot of individuals were involved with this work, so thanks to my collaborators and staff, the National Institute of Mental Health in the US for funding it, and to the participants and their families.